Béa a commencé à mettre la table en parlant des extraordinaires qualités.
Béa talked about the wonderful qualities of our president, David Black, and he's done so much, and we'd like to express she expressed her affection and her admiration for his work. But I think that we will start off by listening to him and hearing his report so that he can tell us what's happened over the last 3 years. David, you have the floor.
Monsieur Pierre, if you do wish to find out what happened over the last 3 years, you have to read my report on the app, because my speech doesn't really talk about the last 3 years too much. Well, a little bit. Bonjour, mes amis. Good morning, delegates, and welcome to all of you here who have joined us from across our union and from across our country. I cannot begin to express just how wonderful it is to see our entire national union all together in the same place once again. To see so many familiar faces, to see so many new faces, and see such a diversity of faces from people representing so many different industries, so many different sectors, and from so many backgrounds, from so many different walks of life, to be gathered here, to be united here. It reminds me of what it is to be a union. Not just to be in a union, but to be united. To be one, but to represent all. That's why we're here. And that's what the theme of our convention is. It starts with equity. L'équité d'abord. But first, I want to express my appreciation to Elder, or Knowledge Keeper, Shane Point from the Musqueam, for providing our delegates with a traditional welcome to these territories this morning. The city that we call Vancouver, you're going to hear it a lot in the next 3 days, is the most picturesque and beautiful place in the world. But many of you may not know that this land, unlike some other parts of Canada, has never had a signed treaty. And this is why we use the terms unceded lands and territory. Simply put, we are on land here that has been stolen. We are on land that is the traditional, ancestral, unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples. Specifically, here in Vancouver, we're on lands that rightfully belong to the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. The city of Vancouver was incorporated officially in 1886. But it was only in 2014 when the city of Vancouver formally acknowledged that it was on unceded territory. It took nearly 130 years even to just formally acknowledge that, yes, the land was simply taken from its original inhabitants. Even though we've all known it, but sometimes the things we are closest to are the things that we have the hardest time admitting. Namely, our shortfalls, or that progress has just not gotten far enough or fast enough. Many of you here gathered today know me. Some of you for a lot longer than others, but there may be some of you who are just meeting me for the first time. So, I want to take a quick moment to introduce myself. The act of introducing myself may seem like a simple one, but it's critical for everybody in this room to understand who I am and the role that I play. It is a bigger part of equity. Just as we strive to make our convention accessible and inclusive for all, including for those whose first language is French or for English, or for those who have difficulties hearing, we have to give everybody the same understanding of our union. And it begins with me, your president. My name is David Black, and for the past 6 years, I've had the privilege and honor of serving as president of our national union, COPE SEPB. I've been part of this union family for far longer than that, 27 years. As a matter of fact, dating back to when I first joined ICBC, the public auto insurer here in British Columbia, when I was 29 years old. So I was a young worker when I started. My mother is Dawn Black. She is a former New Democratic Party member of Parliament and former interim leader of the BC NDP. My father is Peter Black, an educator and a lacrosse Hall of Famer. And if you watch the video, you see I managed to get lacrosse in the video as well. Rachel will appreciate that. From them, I learned the value of teamwork, leadership, and understood why the fight for the rights of workers and labor conditions is so critical and never-ending. And I also want to share the story of this, my eye patch, which is for something that those of you who are meeting me for the first time, it's certainly quite noticeable. But for those of you who have known me for a while, it's something that might not be noticeable anymore. As some of you may know, I am a childhood cancer survivor. I had a very rare form of cancer that resulted in the loss of my eye at a very young age. It's a bit of a sensitive issue to me, especially when I think back to my youth, but even into adulthood, because I have been at some times subjected to jokes ranging from some lighthearted teasing to some pretty hateful name-calling, actually. It's become a habit for me not to draw attention to it. In fact, I was wavering whether or not to actually tell this story as I was preparing the speech today. It's gotten to the point where I try not to think about it as a disability, even though it really is. And I've been reminded of that time to time in the past. I remember once being denied a rental vehicle while traveling in the UK because they wouldn't rent to somebody who only had one eye, even though I had a driver's license and there was no disqualifications. My point to tell this story isn't to try and elicit sympathy from you, but I would be remiss if I didn't remind of the harassment policy that we passed earlier today. My point in sharing the story is I want you to try and look through the lens of someone who is from an equity-seeking group. And if I am being honest with myself, this is a form of disability. And I should count myself as being in the equity-seeking group as a person with a disability. How many people who belong to equity-seeking groups have felt the need to hide who they are, to downplay their identity, maybe under the guise of not wanting to be a disturbance or to draw attention to themselves, because they don't want to be treated differently. And by differently, I mean belittled, or told that it's just not a big deal, or told that they should just try harder to fit in, or that they shouldn't complain so much. Think about how many women have had advances made on them in the workplace, or in their union. Or to have such comments as, "Oh, it's sure nice to have a good-looking woman around here." Think about how someone who identifies as LGBTQ feel when they have no other choice but to let it slide when someone makes a comment like, "Oh, that's so gay." Or how an Indigenous person may have to endure an interrogation when they want to open a bank account. Or how a Black person needs to explain whose car they are driving despite their registration clearly matching their ID. Or how an Asian person has to brush off flyers being passed around their community, complaining about too many Chinese signs, or around making references to the China flu. Or think about how a person with a disability would rather put themselves through physical pain instead of asking for help, because their experience has been whomever they ask for help always rolls their eyes or calls them a pain when they do so. Now, these are just words and gestures, but we all know it can get much worse. They can be outwardly explicit, like violent acts, or they can be very much hidden, but buried deep in our practices, making them systemic, such as an employer decides, well, let's not hire that person who's paraplegic because our office just isn't set up for them. We don't want to go through the trouble of changing it. Or if a sports team decides, well, let's not draft that player because then we'll have to explain about having an openly gay person on our team. or sign a black football player who wants to take a knee to talk about police violence. There's a reason we need to come from a place of equity, a reason why the work we are doing now and the work of these next few days is so critical, especially for our union. Because it's not just about recognizing that those who belong to these groups are among us. It's not just about recognizing an issue, but deciding arbitrarily what we are going to do because we feel it's appropriate. It's about involving them. It's about including them. It's about lifting up their voices. And it's about listening to what they have to say and then taking the right actions. And we can't take the right actions or even know what the right actions are unless we start from a point of equity. It starts with equity. Speaking about my own personal situation, and not that I'm asking anyone to feel sorry for me, but part of the reason why I might not personally see this as a limitation or consider it to be a disability is because maybe I don't want to feel othered. It might just be that the systems we have in place in our society don't provide a safe, inclusive enough atmosphere for me to be able to step up and say, I have every right, just as much right as those with two fully functioning eyes, to be properly accommodated and included as much as possible. And not just to be told, sorry, we don't rent vehicles to people with one eye. Now, despite all of that, let me be clear. I know that I have a lot of privilege that others here in our world do not have. I am very lucky to call this land my home with my partner, Maya, and our 3 children, who are growing up so much faster than I could have ever imagined. And they teach me more about the world every day in the same way I've learned so much more about our world and our union and about people and what matters to them from all my time here in this union. Just look around you in this room here. So many people here today work hard at making our members' lives better. And that's what the next 3 days are about. We're here to learn, to listen, to understand, and to do it from a starting point of equity. As many of you are aware, and if you weren't, let the cat out of the bag, I am not seeking re-election in this position. People knew. I have been so privileged to have been leader of this union and to have followed in the footsteps of tremendous people who have worked so hard to build this union up. Some of those folks are here today, people like Jerry New, Serge Cadieux and Simon Berlin, Pierre Gingras, Gwynnie Farrell, Liz Fong, Patty Clancy, Valerie Roberts-Francis, who's somewhere upstairs in her room, Casey Ora, Chantal Dumoulin, Maurice Laplante, and Kim Wilson. And really, there are so many more that I would like to name right now, but we're having elections right now, so I'm going to keep my thanks to those folks until after that's done. And many other people over the years who have worked tirelessly behind the scenes. There is one person, though, that I will name, and I am forever indebted to, and who's made it possible for me to do this job to the best of my ability, and who really is the magic behind making sure everything needs to get done, does get done. And that is Karen Caston. Karen has been there every step of the way for me and for others. Oh, you went ahead too much. Both on the national level and as the Director of Executive Administration in our local, and on the national level as the Assistant to the President for the past 6 years. I want to acknowledge you, Karen, for all of your support for me, for our national union, and for all the members that we help support. Thank you so much, Karen. Now, before we get started today into the serious business of the convention, you would have all seen the introduction video to kick off our convention, and there are a lot of fun elements in that video, and many hidden features, including strategically placed COPE SEPB logos and employer logos indicating each region as we moved our way across the country, finally arriving here in Vancouver. You also saw many faces on the screen, photos of our actual members from across the country, as well as representations on the sides showing the incredible diversity of our members from across this union. The fun part for me, especially being someone who has had the opportunity to go across the country many times because of the work of being in this union, is seeing the landmarks come up in the cartoon. In some ways, it's telling the story of our country. We'll keep showing the video throughout the convention, and I encourage you to watch and focus on different elements of the video. But after that, I stop and think, this is really just one version of our story, isn't it? How much of that story is written by people whose faces resemble those we see in the photos, or those faces that we have representations of? I opened my speech talking about the history of the city of Vancouver. How much of the history of the city is only now being shared by those whose ancestors were those who originally were on this land and still are on this land, long before English Captain George Vancouver set foot here and, quote, discovered it, end quote. How much of the story of our union was written by people who don't necessarily look like me? A cisgender, middle-aged, apparently able-bodied white male. How much of the story of our union going forward will be written by those whose pictures we just saw? And will we recognize the crucial role that equity plays in writing the story of our union these next few days and beyond? Now, when we were last together in 2019, many of us will recall that we left that convention with a bad taste in our mouths. We had delegates who left feeling they were not being heard. They were not given respect. They were not being seen as equals. As president, I have to take responsibility for that. We left feeling divided. That is the truth of the matter. But we on the national executive didn't just sit there and say, oh, well, that's too bad. They'll get over it. Maybe in 3 years we'll try again. No, we don't back down from a challenge. We don't do that when we're sitting across the table from the employer, and we don't do that when we're sitting together in this room with our union. We had a goal of making this union better and wanting to live up to our enormous potential. So we went to work. At one of our first National Executive Board meetings after that convention, we undertook anti-oppression training. And I think that's something that we should be doing at least once per term for our National Executive. And we came out of that with a renewed commitment to address the needs of equity-seeking groups in our union. But also, in the last 3 years, things out of our control have divided us, quite literally, over these last 3 years. For large chunks of time, COVID-19 prevented us from being able to get together with each other. It forced many of us into isolation and took us and our families away from friends and colleagues. And all of us had to deal with suddenly new challenges. New in the sense with dealing with a global pandemic, but also not so new in the sense that workplace issues have always been first and foremost for all of us in our work with our union. All of us had to deal with our members being laid off, members who suddenly had massive workloads thrust upon them because of the shifts in their workplaces, members dealing with isolation and the mental health strains it brought upon them, and members suddenly having to learn new technologies and transition their home environment from a personal space into a workspace. But we also saw significant events at home and around the world over these last 3 years that remind us of why we must not ignore the voices of those who are in equity-seeking groups. Some of us here, like myself, enjoy privilege that often makes our lives easier. But our job as a union is to make our members' lives better. And we cannot ignore that some of our members don't have all the same privileges and, quite frankly, face barriers at work, in their communities, and sometimes in our union. This means we've got work to do. And failing to recognize that we need to start with equity means failing to learn from events in our present and our past. And not acting on these things means doing a disservice to our members, many of whom are directly affected by these events or can see themselves reflected in these events. The list I'm about to read is far too long. From the discovery of residential school graves across this province and then across our country, the murder of George Floyd in the United States, the killing of 4 members of a Muslim family in London, Ontario, the mass shooting in Nova Scotia that killed 22 people, the 10 people in Buffalo, New York, killed while just out shopping for groceries in a racially motivated attack, the 8 people, including 6 Asians, killed in Atlanta, Georgia, and all the other anti-Asian hate crimes and attacks that have been prevalent since the start of the pandemic. Or the fact that the Orlando gay nightclub shooting had on that community only a few years ago, where 49 gay people were murdered and another 53 seriously wounded. But also the history of attacks against women, from the incredible massacre of women in Montreal in 1989 at L'École Polytechnique, or the hundreds of Indigenous women and girls who have been murdered, and many more who are still missing. Those are just a few of the events that have happened in the past 3 years. From these incidents, we have seen a response. We have seen communities come together in support of residential school survivors and a push for better education of the horrors of the residential school system and what reconciliation means moving forward. We have seen the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in response to the George Floyd murder, but also to many other similar events as well. We have seen increasing recognition and dialogue around the dangers and prevalence of white supremacy and neo-Nazism in our society. Anti-hate groups have sprung up, including ones supporting the Asian community in response to the targeted attacks that have occurred against members of those communities. The credit for that truly goes to members of those communities and their allies for stepping up, being courageous, and taking action. But did it really need to get to these worst-case scenarios before action was taken? Where were we as Canadians when we saw Indigenous families first being ripped apart? Where were we when Black communities told us that law enforcement was not on their side? Where were we when Chinese and Japanese people were being treated as second-class citizens, not even people with rights in this country? Where were we when members of the LGBT community were thrown in jail, lost their jobs, and sometimes their lives, simply because of who they love? We have come a long way. And at the same time, it's not far enough. And we know there are more challenges ahead of us. And we cannot continue to ignore the warning signs, even if they put us in uncomfortable positions today. What do we do in response to Putin's war in Ukraine, or the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida that was passed into law, or the continued attack on the rights of transgender individuals? Closer to home, particularly for those of us from BC, are we listening to all of those who are calling out the impact of the climate crisis that has manifested itself into killer floods and killer fires? What about those who are protesting the Coastal GasLink project through Wet'suwet'en land? And then we have the tax on healthcare workers, the online vitriol directed at health professionals, like blocking access routes to hospitals and care facilities, the so-called Freedom Convoy, and the misappropriation of the Canadian flag to symbolize this new form of hate. How are we responding? How have we responded appropriately? These tragedies are not isolated incidents. Our members see themselves reflected in these events. Are we listening to what they are telling us and in how they want us to respond? Or are we stifling them in order to preserve our existing structure? But by doing so, are we living up to our values about being a union that respects and values diversity? Can we still walk out of this convention priding ourselves by saying we work to lift up the voices of those in equity-seeking groups? The answer to that last question, at least in 2019, was no. Many of the delegates there clearly felt that. How do we want to leave this convention in 2022? That's not to say that we have not made strides since our last time together, despite the less than ideal ending. In 2019, our theme was inspired to action. And while we acknowledge that there's still many areas that where we need to take action, to be inspired to further action, there has been a lot that we have managed to accomplish for our members, especially in this very challenging global pandemic. One of the greatest signs of solidarity that we witnessed 3 years ago came when delegates across our national union stepped up and showed the support for the members of Move Up who had been on strike for over half a year at that point at Westminster Savings Credit Union, because they were trying to save their pension plan, not only for themselves, but for the next wave of workers to come. There were but 8 people in that bargaining unit, and they could have easily capitulated to their employer. But it was the support and strength that you gave them in this room that let them fight one day longer. And in the end, even though that certification isn't there, we made sure with your support that every single one of those members ended up in a much better place than when that dispute began. Our national union also stepped up in a big way when Move Up ran its Driving Public campaign a couple of years ago. Not only to try and help restore public confidence in the public auto insurer that had become the previous BC Liberal government's piggy bank, but to preserve the jobs of over 5,000 members, representing nearly half of the folks in Region 4. I'm happy to say that the campaign was a success. We not only pushed government to take the steps needed to fix ICBC, but we in BC now have enjoyed the largest rate decrease in the corporation's history. And people here are once again beginning to understand the value of public insurance over private insurance. But we also warded off an existential threat to our local in Region 4. About half the delegates you see in this section over here would not be here had that privatization gone through. It was, in a very big way, thanks to our national union, who stepped up with the funds and resources so that we could ensure and do the necessary work to win that campaign and preserve those members' jobs. But not every campaign is successful. Despite some of our best efforts, SEPB Quebec fought a lengthy, years-long battle with a tremendously anti-union employer in Laurentian Bank. And after warding off years of decertification attempts, it unfortunately finally happened in April of last year. Perhaps yet there's another chapter to be written on that story, we can hope. When we are united, we can have success. Here in Region 4, because of the support that Move Up received from SEPB Quebec and COPE Ontario, we were able to expand a federal certification at TSTCF Express to now include members in Quebec and Ontario. That would not have been possible without that support. But it's not just the support in terms of monetary or administrative support. It's the perspective, the stories, the voices that they bring that is even more crucial, and that highlights why we need to hear from these perspectives when we engage in our work. Our organizers in Move Up were able to connect with those prospective new members in Quebec and Ontario because of the support of SEPB Quebec and COPE Ontario gave us. The support was not what matters to people there. Pardon me, the support was not only with translation and interpretation, but actually helping us to understand what matters to people in those places and how we should communicate them and the intricacies that come with that. That's why being open and listening to the voices of those who have that lived experience matters. If we as Move Up had just gone about our business as usual and said, well, they're going to talk to us the way we want to talk to them, we would have fallen flat. So let's take that and apply it to those inequity-seeking groups who have the lived experience and want to tell us how to connect with them and how to support them and how to make them feel included. If our approach to them is to say, this is how we think you should do it, or this is how the world works, and you just have to see it this way, we're going to fall flat every single time. And they will walk out of this room, just as they did 3 years ago, thinking, they don't get us, they're not trying to get us, and they aren't listening to us. And they would have every right to feel that way. I will never have the experience of feeling like a stranger in my own country because the people around me don't understand my preferred language, even though it is one of the country's official languages. I will never know what it's like to make, on average, 10% less doing the same job as somebody else just because their gender is different than mine. I will never know what it's like to feel fear when I'm minding my own business, just driving down the street, and I hear a siren suddenly go off just because of the color of my skin. I will never know what it's like to be told, go back to your own country, when I'm out taking a walk with my family. I will never know what it's like to have my children ripped away from me by RCMP officers, along with all the children of everyone else in my community, to be re-educated because the government found my way of life to be savage. I will never know what it's like to wonder if coworkers, friends, neighbors, or even family members may reject me, hate me, attack me, or even fire me simply because I am transgender, a lesbian, gay, bisexual, or queer. These pains, these traumatic experiences, are the ones I will never personally experience. And yet, I am the one standing up here with a microphone in my face, holding all of you a captive audience. And I have a decision to make. When those who have lived through these pains and these traumatic experiences come to me and the institution that I represent and say, we need you to hear us. We need you to be an ally. We need you to be a difference maker. Do I take the road of saying, well, I know what you need and I'll tell you what that is? Or do I open my ears? Do I give these voices the respect and the platform that they deserve? And do I work with them and all those around us to make meaningful decisions? It's the second road that we, as individuals, as a union, as this union, need to make sure we take, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it challenges our structures. But this is not something unfamiliar to us. We have had our best successes when we have listened to those in equity-seeking groups. And as a union, as a movement, we have achieved things such as we have achieved successes both in and outside of our workplaces because of it. Together with the labor movement, we have achieved such things as increases to the minimum wage, paid sick leave in many provinces, and paid domestic violence leave here in British Columbia. Absolutely. Throughout the pandemic, our efforts have yielded support for those most affected, including funding for public transit, directly affecting members in Region 1 and Region 4. I was going to get that backwards. TransLink board members applauding that. And we have pushed governments provincially and federally for support programs, such as the Canada Emergency Response Benefit and the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit, and others such as these. On social issues, our efforts have helped bring an end to conversion therapy in Canada. Legal recognition for non-binary people. And as B said, we have made some progress on ending the discriminatory ban that prevents men who have sex from men from donating blood. And we have a lot more still to do. Whether it's campaigning to decriminalize sex work, continuing to fight the persistent gender pay gap. What does that sign say? I can't believe I still have to protest this shit. Fighting for farmer care and dental care. Fighting for single-step certification. Anti-scab legislation at the national level. That's just a few of the things that we see as being critical for our members in the weeks and months ahead. And there is also the push to ensure that we elect progressive governments that we can make these things possible. In BC, we have been very fortunate for the last 5 years, but not every province is as fortunate. Since we last gathered, we'd seen the turn back towards fiscal and social conservatism in provinces like Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. And today, we're going to see if the people of Ontario will reject Doug Ford's anti-worker agenda, or if they'll welcome back for another 4-year term. I hope you all voted from Region 2 before you came. If he does win, then it will mean that we have failed. We have failed to connect with working people. We have failed to listen to the voices who tell us what they needed. And in response, they listened instead to the empty promises of a leader and a party that actively works against their interests. We have work to do, and it starts with equity. I know for some at our table, the concept of equity is a concern, as if it's a challenge to overcome. But why? Why is it that the idea that everybody should be treated fairly and have benefits according to their needs a challenge? Who is it challenging? 18 years ago, a group of us, some of us in this room today, understood equity. We understood equity when we traveled down to Miami, Florida, resolved to break away from the OPIU. We recognized what equity meant, and we knew we didn't have it. Because those of us who are members in Canada saw we were getting the short end of the stick. We were part of the large group, the OPIU. We were part of the big union, but we didn't have a say, not really, at least not where it mattered, and at least in a way that was anything more than performative. We recognized that. We challenged that. And when we challenged that, how did those in the OPIU react? How did they respond? Did they respond by saying, oh, thank you very much for bringing it to our attention. Let's look at our structures and recognize that the inequities should exist and work to improve those things? You can hear some stories from the folks sitting in the front row about how they responded. No, it was exactly the opposite. They tried to assert their power. They tried every mechanism they could, by the book, to make sure that we had nowhere to turn. And that is what led to 2004 in Miami. 18 years ago, we stood up collectively to fight for equity. This union literally started with equity. And we saw the strength we had when people came together and stood up in the name of equity. Now here we are, 18 years later. And once again, we're being asked to stand up for equity. But in 18 years, we've come to learn there is so much more about what equity means and about the many different equity-seeking groups. It's not that they didn't exist 18 years ago, but it's actually that their voices were the ones that were effectively silenced. They were the ones who were told, work within the system, understand your place, and know your role. When we examine ourselves today, throughout these next 3 days, and look towards the direction we set for this union going forward, let's ask ourselves this question. What side of the table are we on? Are we the ones standing together for equity? Or are we the ones trying to silence those voices because we are threatened by anything that is not the status quo? Yesterday, leading up to convention, we had 6 equity caucus meetings. We had a caucus for Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis, a caucus for workers with disabilities, a caucus for racialized workers, a caucus for those who identified as 2S LGBTQIA+, a caucus for those who identified as women, and a caucus for young workers. Throughout these next few days, we're going to hear from those voices. Sometimes those voices are going to challenge us. Those voices bring an understanding of the world that many of us, certainly many of us up on the stage here, won't fully grasp. Are we going to listen to those voices? Are we going to take what those voices say and take action that show our solidarity behind them? The same way we all came together in 2004 in Florida? Or are we going to be the ones that say, we hear you, but we're more interested in preserving the status quo? I challenge us to be the former. I challenge us not to look at equity as something to overcome, but something to be embraced. When we stood up for equity in 2004, we became stronger together. When we stand up for equity today, we will all become stronger. Our diversity is not something to be overcome. It is something to be embraced. Striving for equity is not a burden. It's an opportunity. It is essential. It is required. And it's what makes us strong, and it will make us stronger. It starts with equity. Mes amis, l'équité.
Friends, equity first.
Agir.
It's time to act. Thank you very much.